We came here to camp, and Kenny's main objective is to burn cans. And if you notice within the fire, and Doug, please get a shot of this.
There you go.
Can with one can in there.
The footage you're looking at was recorded at an upstate New York campsite in 1997, and despite having a pretty terrifying secret, it gets very little coverage in the unexplained media communities. Now, if you watch the channel, you'll know I'm not usually a cryptid guy or anything like that, but this footage is super compelling, and it's one of those uncanny old home videos that I think you'll love. I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstory first. If you watch a lot of true crime or mystery content, you're probably one of those people who know just about every single story. In fact, that was me as a viewer for the better part of 10 years. There's certainly nothing wrong with covering cases that many people have already touched on. I did one in my last video, but on this channel I really make a genuine effort to dig up stuff that basically no one has heard about. And so, in this video, I'm going to be firing off a list of some of the most obscure mysteries that you almost certainly haven't heard of. And instead of just focusing on 3 stories like I usually would, I'm going to cover way more entries this time and just go a little less deep into all of them. Sort of like how you'd approach an iceberg chart, except there's no iceberg and there's no fucking chart. This first entry pertains to a supposed Bigfoot video from 1997 that's known as the New York Baby footage, and it was recorded by Doug Prigden near the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. It features a group of young men and women who were at a music festival on a private plot of land, but decided to set up their campsite quite far away from the actual festival grounds. At one point while around the fire, one of the group members, Doug Prigden, started filming the event and focusing on one of his buddies who was joking around and using a branch as a microphone. He really just brought his camera for documentation purposes, as he knew they were going to have a great time and he would want to look back on the footage years down the line. There's not really much that happens in the footage, it's just one of those wholesome 90s home videos that were made purely for personal reasons, back when people actually spoke to each other. However, it wasn't until 6 years later in 2003, when Doug went back to look over some of the old footage and reminisce, that he realized something incredibly strange about it. Throughout the footage, we can see what looks like some sort of ape quickly jumping from branch to branch on some trees far into the background, behind his friends. It was a forested area, but there is said to be only one other campsite near them. Either way, these aren't movements that a human being are capable of, but it does resemble some sort of a primate. There's a lot of theories on this video, but to this day, there's no definitive answer. Given the area, a lot of people deem this to be some sort of young or baby version of Bigfoot that's jumping around, but of course, that's up to personal interpretation. In terms of other theories, a lot of people think it's just some sort of bag caught on the branch that's waving back and forth, but I disagree, because if you look earlier in the footage, it was first on the other tree, and then after that it's just going back and forth. To me, these movements look deliberate and not like a bag or a piece of fabric going with the wind. Another theory is that whatever this is actually in the foreground and is some sort of bug caught in a web closer to the camera. There's no shortage of theories on what this could be, but it's generally believed not to be any sort of hoax. I mean, you could argue that it looks like Doug is intentionally pointing the camera to the background, but remember, this wasn't a cell phone camera. He's basically just pointing towards his friend and hoping he gets a sufficient angle. If you ask me, the best theory I've seen is that this is some sort of illegally imported exotic animal that got loose. And I think Kitty Cat B on Reddit posed a very good question. Why do people always jump to Bigfoot when the more obvious and sane answer is that America has a ton of exotic pets, some of whom escape or are released deliberately into the wild when they become too much to handle? That's obviously somebody's monkey. To me, this does look like the most likely answer though. Those movements just look far too fluid and mammalian to be some sort of bag or shirt. However, there's still no definitive answer to this, and I think that's half the fun when it comes to this type of footage. I love these type of Bigfoot videos that aren't just like some guy dressed up in a suit, and even if there is some obvious explanation, it's still fun to just sit there and try to figure out what it is. Let me know what you guys think below. So this one's pretty interesting. It pertains to a planned attack in a Philadelphia bus terminal that was stopped before it came to fruition. The only thing is, this happened in late September of 2001, and given the very recent events in New York City, you'd think that this would have been a much more popular story than it was. A few people remembered it, but chalked it up to some sort of Mandela effect until they posted publicly about it and were able to find some articles online. On September the 29th of 2001, a person walked into the Center City Greyhound terminal in Philly, and before traveling they rented a locker and placed a suitcase in it. A few days later, on October 3rd, no one claimed the bag, so they cleared out the locker and threw the suitcase into storage. It sat there for a few weeks before some people finally opened it, and they found a block of military-grade C4 and almost 1,000 feet of detonating cord. So it wasn't actually set up to go off yet or anything, but it was obviously sitting there with some sort of plan to be transported or used later. The thing is, no one ever came and picked it up. This absolutely did blow up in the media on the day of its discovery, no pun intended. They figured that since there was so much blasting cord found that the military-grade block of C4 had to be part of some much bigger plan. And after all, this was not even a month after one of the country's most horrible events. The FBI stated that they were going to track down its origins within days, based on markers, and then, suddenly, nothing ever came of this again. There was complete media silence, no updates, no arrests, nothing. And the story just eventually withered away to time. This one's complicated because a block of C4 would be lucky to level out someone's detached garage, but again, there was still a theory that this was part of something bigger because of all the det cord. However, a lot of veterans guess that this is simply a case of somebody in the military who tried to pocket leftover range explosives instead of returning it to the ammo dump. Basically, they thought they could get away with pocketing a small amount, which is a crime but happens, and then whoever this was panicked and put it into a locker after leaving base, or just didn't pick it up in time. So there's a large chance that they never revealed who this was, even if they did find out, because it happened from someone within the military. It was military grade, but still, nobody knows for sure. On December 15th, 2022, a completely random human heart was found in a salt pile at a Tennessee Department of Transportation facility. Of course, no one had any idea why it was in the salt pile, and the people who discovered it were completely perplexed, initially thinking it was some sort of dehydrated animal heart. It was said to be about the size of a baseball. Of course, law enforcement were called just to be sure, and they were equally perplexed. And after sending this heart to a TBI crime lab for testing, it was confirmed to be a heart that belonged to an adult male. They started working on a DNA profile around a week after the event, which only usually takes a few weeks, so if they did find anything through this, as far as I can see, there's absolutely been no updates. In fact, if you look up anything pertaining to this case and restrict it to the past year, there's only one or two things that come up. And there's no updates, it's still completely unsolved. There's a lot of questions here that no one has an answer to. Was this some sort of medical waste that somehow ended up there? Was this related to some sort of crime? It is being treated as a homicide case, but it's complex because there's no reports of any victims in the area or the area where the salt came from who were found with their heart missing. Additionally, no medical labs nearby reported a lost heart. I've seen some people theorize that this could have been some sort of archaeological find and that the heart was somehow preserved in the salt, but that's not in my area of expertise and something about it just seems unlikely. One thing's for sure though, there was almost certainly a human involved with this. In the words of legal analyst Nick Leonardo for News Channel 5, a heart doesn't naturally leave the body as part of the decaying process, so clearly there's some human involvement here. And the question is if it's criminal in nature. And since late 2022, there's been no updates on the source of this incredibly bizarre mystery. Delores Brown, or Dee Dee as she preferred to be called, was a lively 19-year-old First Nations woman from Penelakut Island in BC, Canada. On the warm summer night of July 27th, 2015, so almost 10 years ago now, Dee Dee went out to a beach with a bunch of her friends to participate in an Indigenous game night that was being thrown on the island. It was said that on this night a ferry full of travelers from off the island showed up and joined them for the event. It was by all means a great time, but unfortunately, at the end of the night when everyone went home, Dee Dee never made it back. She was an adult and she was out partying, so at first the family wasn't too concerned, but after a day or two and the discovery of her wallet, iPod, and cell phone in her own room, her family went to the police. A search was launched and investigators would work hard combing the waters for a few weeks before eventually finding her deceased and washing up around a separate island. And sadly, this is where the investigators' hard work stopped. Since then, there's been essentially zero leads and a permanent scar has been left on both her family members and the communities on Penelakut Island as a whole. Family friends launched billboard campaigns and spoke about it actively, desperate to get to the bottom of this, but sadly, it would never result in more information. Given her state, this was obviously deemed a homicide and foul play is massively suspected. However, it seems the RCMP never looked too far deep into this and it doesn't take a genius to figure out why. This one just kinda gets under my skin as there's so little coverage on it and it's a cut and clean homicide case of a young woman who had her entire life ahead of her, one who is loved by everyone in her community. The individual responsible is still at large and family friends were quoted as saying, "She's our loved one, she's our sister, and she's not to be thrown away." The whole island, they're haunted by this. There's a feeling of unrest. It's hard to go on without closure. Her mother still hurts daily with the loss, she has a hard time coping, and it's left unresolved and there's no justice for her daughter. If you lose a daughter, it's the most heart-wrenching, heartbreaking thing you will ever go through. It just doesn't seem like enough. More needs to happen. And unfortunately, as of a few years ago, the RCMP still provided no update on the Delores Brown case. It remains completely cold to this day. Rest in peace to her. This one's more of just an extremely creepy coincidence than it is a mystery, but I think it fits in the video. There's a ton of media out there that, in hindsight, seems to resemble a major event that hasn't yet taken place. The best example being all the things that have happened in The Simpsons. But some of them are more compelling than others, and some are just complete BS. This entry pertains to a piece of media that was released on July 17th of 2001. On that day, a synthpop collective named I Am the World Trade Center released an album called Out of the Loop, and believe it or not, the 11th track in the album was called September. This was of course just under 2 months prior to a series of events that would change the world forever, and the chances of something like this happen are just so insane to me. The song name and the number is one thing, but when you combine that with the name of the band, it's just on an entirely different level. People at the time took this as them capitalizing on the attacks, but in reality, this was released before any of that happened. It also reminds me of the album art that The Coup selected for their 2001 album called Party Music. The cover was selected in June of that year and is almost an exact representation of what would happen a few months later. But fortunately for them, it would never be released to the public with this specific art. Eerily enough, it was actually set to release in early September, and then was pushed back to November, so that actually ended up massively working in their favor, and they obviously picked different art. I can't even imagine how people would view this if the album did end up being released with that art just a week or so before this happened. Stuff like this kind of shows you that coincidences are a thing, as if it'd been released at that time with that art, people would collectively be claiming to this day that it was subliminally hinted at in the media or something, but it really is just an insane coincidence. Also guys, just quickly, I don't do sponsorships or anything in these videos, but if you are interested, I do have a Patreon where I post the uncensored versions of these videos, and on top of that, I'm working on a series exclusively for there that has absolutely no limits on what I can show, and there's already a couple of them up. I often get asked how people can support me, but I can't stress this enough, only do this if it's within your means, as you can get more than enough enjoyment out of my videos on here. I'm a massive believer in people doing things at their own will, not based off of some silly shit. But a lot of people don't even know I have a Patreon, so I'm just trying to plug it in a bit more. It's still sort of in its infancy, but there's a lot planned. Trust me. The case of the Gill family disappearance is one that took place in Argentina in early 2002, and I can almost guarantee that unless you're from there, you've never heard of this. As Lazy Masquerade would put it, it's region locked. On the 13th of January in 2002, an entire family in Argentina, consisting of 6 people, vanished, and to this day, nobody knows what happened, and the government is even offering a $12 million reward for anyone who can provide valuable information. The family consisted of 56-year-old Ruben Gill, his 26-year-old wife Margarita Gallegos, and their 4 children ranging from 4 to 11 years old. They were a working-class family who lived and worked on a ranch that was owned by a man named Alfonso Goet. On the evening of January 12, 2002, the family went to a friend's funeral at a nearby town, and that was the last time they were ever seen. It was said that shortly after this, their landlord and employer, Alfonso Goet, gave them a 3-month vacation off of work, which they happily took. 3 months later in April, however, when the family never returned, Alfonso called some of their family relatives to let them know that he hadn't yet seen them, and obviously they hadn't heard anything either, and there has been absolutely no trace of these 6 individuals since, other than one woman claiming to have seen Ruben on horseback in one of the years following. But many investigations were launched, with no success. Now, obviously based on everything I just told you, you're probably most suspicious of Alfonso Goet, and you'd be absolutely right for a number of reasons. He was the only other name I mentioned, and there was a purpose to that. For one, this man had a bad relationship with the family. He supposedly owed them money for crop sales, the family had a labor lawsuit against him for mistreatment, and some people around town even had their suspicions that the youngest son in the Gill family was his. On top of this, it was unusual for this Alfonso guy to even give them a week or 2 off, let alone 3 months, and he was the one essentially mapping out the whole situation to the extended family and police as if he was deliberately constructing it. Alfonso Goet passed away in a car accident in 2016, and another investigation was launched in 2018, once again with no success. The leading theory is that Alfonso Goet was somehow involved or responsible, but there was never any definitive proof, and he's now deceased anyways. There was also just a lot of poor investigative work in general with this case, like, for example, the initial investigation didn't even begin until a year after they were reported missing, which to me just seems lazy and negligent. Of course, I'm not native to the area, and I have no idea how one of these cases would typically even be approached. This is certainly a topic that could have its own video entirely, but I'd need translators and a lot more quality sources. 23 years later, the vanishing of this entire family still remains completely unsolved. On August 4th, 2022, NASA's 2020 Perseverance rover was taking routine photos of its tools on Mars to verify that everything was in working order. This is just part of their rigorous process and is typically done after they do any sort of boring on Mars's surface to ensure no damage was done. In this particular case, photos were taken of the drill and the sample collection kit that was packed with samples they might send back to Earth. And in one of the pictures of the drill chuck, something very interesting is seen. There appeared to be some sort of hair-like piece of debris resting on the chuck that many people claimed resembled cat hair. This is unusual as they don't typically see stuff like this, and just a few weeks prior, they saw a separate tangle of fibers on Mars's actual surface. This is more than likely just one of those explainable, gimmicky sets of articles, sort of like the Volume 1 entry with the plankton in space, but I honestly just love adding some of these small entries in because they're fun and sort of remind me of something I would have seen and totally believed on the internet 20 years ago. NASA claimed that they'd be looking into the origin of this debris, and it's not the first time they've found stuff like this. It's more than likely just some sort of leftover stuff that was churned up in the dust from when the rover landed. But it's still very strange how it ended up within the drill, especially considering how rigorously tracked these are and how nothing else was found within it. It's certainly some sort of hair, but I don't think there's cats on Mars. Nonetheless, a lot of people believe this to be some real evidence at the time, and no one has really spoken about it since. It also just makes me laugh because I can already picture everyone's insane Facebook family members sharing this and fully believing it. Now, back to a serious entry. This case took place in Bristolville, Ohio in 1995. A happily married couple named Shelley and John Markley, who had 5 children aged 8 to 15, disappeared without a trace under pretty suspicious circumstances, and to this day, they've never been located. Here's the story. In 1995, 31-year-old Shelley Markley and 36-year-old John Markley were going through a pretty tough time. They had 5 amazing children, and they were said to be amazing parents, but life had been really tough on them in the years prior, and so in this year, their spirits weren't exactly that high. This is important for reasons we'll get to shortly. For one, John's twin sister and best friend was fighting breast cancer. The couple raised a bunch of money, tried everything, and even paid for her to go get some experimental treatment in Mexico, but ultimately, his sister would lose her battle on the 13th of December in 1995. On top of this, the Markleys lost their home to a fire just 2 years prior in 1993, and John also lost his uncle and his nephew in 1994. Suffice to say, luck was absolutely against John and his poor family in the early 90s, but despite all of this, they held things down and pushed forward for the kids. On December 15, 1995, so 2 days after the passing of John's twin sister, the 2 loving parents would get the children ready for school and send them off. This day was going to be a busy one as John's sister's funeral was the next day on December 16th. So they'd have to prepare for this not just emotionally, but practically as well. Funerals are a lot of work. When the kids returned from school later that day, however, their parents, John and Shelley, were nowhere to be found, and this is where things get very weird. The first thing that the kids noticed upon arriving home from school was that the door was unlocked and there was a burnt smell coming from inside of the house. This ended up being the coffee pot that was left on, but there were many other strange things. John's wristwatch that he never took off was sitting above the stove, Shelley's cigarettes were there and she wouldn't leave the house without them, and most notably, their 1990 silver Chevy was not in the driveway. The funeral clothes were ready to go for the next day, so to me it looks as though they were abruptly interrupted amidst all of their planning. In the same bedroom where the funeral clothing was, the couple's gun safe was opened and completely empty. There's children in the house, so this was usually locked. After waiting a bit for their parents, they decided to ring up their aunt and uncle who would pick up the kids in the meantime, and when nothing was heard by the next day, again the day of John's sister's funeral, the extended family contacted the police. The 1990 silver Chevy was found in a hardware store parking lot around 10 miles away with no keys. Shelley's cell phone was in the very muddy cab, which was usually clean, and a transport truck tire was found in the back with 2 tarps. Additionally, a teller at a bank in Bloomfield claimed to see John drive through around noon on the 15th, with Shelley in the middle and another man on the passenger side. While at the bank, they cashed a check made out to Shelley for about $1,000. The only lead that came after this was from one of John's co-workers. This man claimed he was holding them hostage and was demanding $100,000, but he was deemed by authorities to just be a guy who was seizing on the opportunity to get some cash, and he was charged with extortion. And this man was otherwise not regarded as a suspect, which is just absolutely insane to me because he was a co-worker and he was reportedly also out there claiming that the family owed him $1,000, which is exactly what was on the check that they cashed on the day of the disappearance. Either way, a lot of people guess that this is related to money. These 5 children lost their aunt, their grandfather, their cousin, their house, and now their parents 10 days before Christmas, all in the span of a few years. It's just absolutely heartbreaking to imagine what these poor kids went through, and given that they would now be in their 30s and 40s, I can only hope that they're doing much better and have worked to get over what took place in the early 90s. In the years since, a few people have been interviewed, but there's still no answer. Thank you guys so much for watching, I really do appreciate it. If you enjoy these kind of videos, please consider liking or subscribing, but if not, that's totally fine. Just watching is good enough. I upload 2 videos just like this every week, and I'd love to have you back. I also just want to give another massive shout out to all of my patrons. I can't even put into words how grateful I am for the community I've developed over the past 5 to 6 months. I'm working at this the absolute best I can, and I'm just really trying to focus on video quality and community over everything else.